the question is about the idea of the shared city in relationship to design projects that I work on. Yeah, it's pretty fundamental. I mean, the city is, I like to say that if you love nature, you need to love the city, because the city is the only solution, given population growth and just the sheer stress on natural resources. So the stress on water resources, on food and agricultural land, on energy resources, on waste issues, etc. It just makes no sense for people to think they love nature so they want to live in nature, because there's too many people and not enough land. So cities are where it's at, and we all need to understand that cities are going to become denser. We're going to have to share them, and we're going to have to share the space and share the resources. And as a consequence of sharing the city, there's the big question about how to make sure that the city is attractive for human beings to raise a family, to have children in the city, to have schools and opportunities for children and families to flourish in a city that's going to become denser and more competitive and more restricted in terms of its amenities, which only leads to a greater sense of sharing and needing to share the space and the resources of the city. When it comes down to the specific design of a project, inevitably I am thinking of how that space is going to be shared. It's shared on the one hand politically and ideologically, because different people see the project differently. People who are interested in birds and nature have a very ecological, naturalistic, environmental interest in the project. Other people who see it from the point of youth culture and arts and social life have a very different point of view. People who are interested in health and fitness and using space to run and get exercise have a totally different agenda. So any space that we design in the city is shared, and different people come at it for different reasons. And so the intelligence of the design has to be both accommodating and flexible and supportive of all of these different interest groups. I think landscape design, landscape architecture is more traditionally associated with the design of parks, waterfronts, public spaces. Inevitably greenery and natural systems is involved. There might be lakes and streams and ponds and rivers, plantings, meadows, woodlands, gardens and pathways, and small structures and pavilions and artifacts and features within that landscape. That's the traditional notion, and I think that still has some validity. I think when we think of great cities like Prague or London or Paris or New York, we think of their public spaces and their parks and their gardens. However, I also think at the same time that the challenge facing cities, because of what we just spoke about, the sort of the challenge of density, the challenge of mix, the challenge of experience, the challenge of sharing the space of the city, requires more than parks and gardens and waterfronts. It requires a more synthetic and a more inclusive approach to how the city is conceived. So, for example, for me, when you think about your typical figure ground plan, which is a black and white figure of the city, all of the buildings are black and all of the white space. The streets and all of the space in between is white. It's generally thought of that the figure is dominant, like in a figure drawing. You're drawing the figure, and the figure is the dominant figure. But also in drawing, you're often trained as an artist to draw the space in between, to not look at the figure, but to look at the space in between. That's often the overlooked space, or the space that's harder to see. But when you think about it, the space in between is the most important space. It's the space we all live in. It's the space we share. It's the space we walk around in to get from one place to another. It's where we bump into other people. It's where we're exposed to difference. We're exposed to people who aren't like us but are different. We're exposed to a certain cosmopolitanism. So this space in between is absolutely fundamental, and it doesn't always take the characteristic of a garden or a park or a waterfront. It's a more connective tissue. It's a more abstract system. At the same time, it's a more concrete system. But it's different from an object, and it's different from a place. It's a matrix, it's a network. And that's where we begin to talk about landscape urbanism, where we're talking about urbanism as if it's a landscape, as if buildings and streets are just rivers and geological features in a larger landscape. And the journeys through that system, as well as the flows of energy and all of the performative aspects of the city, how the city works, is embedded in that framework. So landscape urbanism elevates landscape architecture or changes the key task from the placemaking task of parks and gardens and squares and courts and streets, which is still fundamental and still important, but it adds an extra layer of complexity, which is viewing the city as a whole, as a sort of ensemble of connective tissue, of matrices, of figure ground, of spaces in between that need to be designed. Well, again, in the United States in particular, but also in parts of Europe, public process is fundamental because we're talking about public space. So no one wants that space to be determined by a commercial entity like a developer, or even a public entity like government. You know, people are suspicious of government. So people like to be able to have a say in how public space gets shaped. A lot of that is emotional. People are very concerned about what a place looks like and what it feels like. They want to know that it's authentic and unique to their sense of their place. There are competing interests between people that typically want more nature and quietness versus people who want more activity and more active energy. People who want to see some commercial uses, people who want to see no commercial uses. People who are interested in health and fitness versus people who are interested in history and storytelling and interpretation. There are so many different interest groups. So when you embark, or when I embark on a public space design project, I have to reach out to a very broad spectrum of the community. I have to ask them what their best desires are and what their worst fears are for this project, what they would most like to see and what they would least like to see. And then also to lead, because it's not just about asking for input and going from there. It's also about leading, and leading with a vision. So therefore, putting ideas on the table, showing people alternative ways we could do something, pushing innovative and fresh ways to think about things, showing other precedents and other projects that have been very successful, to get people to think with a little bit higher aspiration about what the project could be. Well, we feel like we've been very busy for the past 15 years with projects, and the projects have a lot of demands, a lot of prosaic and pragmatic demands, budgets, schedules, logistics, technical issues. So a lot of life in the office is being a busy professional, trying to solve problems and trying to make the projects the best that we can make them. But there isn't a lot of time for reflection, for sort of taking a step back and reflecting, or while we do try to innovate with projects, it's sometimes difficult in the constraints of the project to really have the time to do research and development and to really push innovative work. So the next task is probably to try to carve out time to explore, to view the office as a little bit more of a laboratory, to try to test a few more innovative approaches with some of our projects. One of the good things is that when you are successful, so the High Line has been successful, is that other clients have more confidence in you. You have more credibility. They believe in you more. So it becomes a little easier to test the limits. But I think the future is probably about trying to see what the next level of work can be.